Hi, my name is Colleen and I work for Compost Tea Canada. Today I'm giving a presentation about how to restore your soil using compost and compost tea. So restoring soils with biology. So let's start off by imagining ourselves in a forest. Take in the sights, the smells, the feelings, the sounds. Maybe close your eyes and imagine the light coming through the canopy and scattering itself on the forest floor, which is covered with trilliums and other spring flowers. Kneeling down and touching the earth, turning over some leaves and studying the hair-like filaments of fungi throughout the leaf pile, and really smelling that earthy smell as you do so. And you notice that this ecosystem is very abundant and diverse, yet it is hardly managed by people. And you wonder, why can't my garden be as rich as this? Why do I need to add nutrients? Where do the nutrients come from that these trees are using and that is supporting this ecosystem? Why don't they get depleted? And what is responsible for making this nutrient cycling happen? It is the life in the soils that is just as diverse and healthy as the above ground system that we are so aware of, that is making this nutrient cycling happen, that is feeding this ecosystem. We don't often think about what's happening beneath our feet because we can't see it. And in the case of the soil life, it's usually microscopic, so you really can't see it. 1 teaspoon of healthy soil actually contains up to 1 billion bacteria, several thousand yards of fungal filaments, several thousand protozoa, and thousands of these little worm creatures called nematodes. These microbes make up the soil food web. So much like a terrestrial food web, the soil food web has a structure from small to large, starting with the plants. The plants use sunlight energy through the process of photosynthesis to create oxygen and sugars. It's not the sugars that the plant gets through photosynthesis that feeds the plant. The plant actually needs a bunch of other nutrients that come from the soil, but the nutrients in the soil are locked up in minerals in a form that the plant can't use. So the plant puts some of these extra sugars that it has created into its root zone, which feeds the bacteria and fungi at the base of the food web. The bacteria and fungi have also been mining other nutrients in the soil, eating these other nutrients, and now they're attracted to the plant root, so they bring it there. And at that zone, now the predators come and consume the bacteria and fungi. And when the nutrients that are in the bacteria and fungi are processed through the metabolism of these higher organisms, it gets converted into a form that the plants can use. So when these higher organisms die, either through being consumed in the food web, where the nutrients get passed along, or they shed or they produce wastes, now nutrients are being released in a plant available form at the zone of the plant root. So this whole food web is taking place really close to the plant root, and it is creating a recycling environment where everybody's happy. So just to give a visual of what these microbes look like that I'm talking about, the main ones I'm talking about are bacteria, fungi, and nematodes. Bacteria are microscopic, often just a circle, but they can be oblong or even filaments. And they're about 1 micrometer long, and they just kind of vibrate, and some of them are more motile, but when you look at it under the microscope, you just see a galaxy of these stars, and that's what you want to see, is a lot of bacteria. Fungi are filamentous, or at least the underground part is the fungal hyphae, and they are about 2 micrometers wide to anywhere around 15 micrometers wide. They can be as long as they want, and they have a branching pattern as they grow. And a good fungi should be darker in color. So the example in this picture might not be a good fungi. In the photo of the bacteria on the left, right in the middle, you can see a strand of fungal hyphae that is darker in color. That is a good-looking fungal hyphae. And then the nematodes are little worm-like creatures. They're actually found all over the world. They're extremely abundant, from the ocean floor to almost any soil on Earth. And there are different functional groups or feeding groups of nematodes. So we classify them by their feeding group when we look at them under the microscope. We look at their mouth parts. And do they eat bacteria? Do they eat fungi? Do they eat other nematodes? So they're called predatory nematodes. Or does it look like they eat plant roots? So those are the 4 main types. So just to recap what nutrient cycling is, it is a symbiotic relationship between plants and bacteria and fungi, meaning that the plants benefit because the bacteria and fungi bring nutrients to the plant root, and the bacteria and fungi benefit because the plant gives them sugars. So plants use photosynthesis to make carbohydrates and sugars and invest a little extra into the root zone in a form that we call exudates. Exudates attract bacteria and fungi, which also mine the soil for other nutrients a plant needs. Those nutrients are locked into crystalline structures that are not available to plants. Bacteria and fungi process these crystalline structures. And then, when the higher organisms consume bacteria and fungi, those essential nutrients are excreted in their wastes, so their dead bodies or their sheddings or their poop, and now it's in a plant available form. So we need that whole soil food web to be intact. Sadly, the Earth is losing topsoil at a devastating rate, and this is due to a number of factors. When you think about what humans are doing on this planet, we are converting a lot of forest and wetland into either land for development or farms, and there's nothing wrong with agriculture when it's done properly, but unfortunately a lot of agricultural practices are harmful to the soil, such as tilling. Tilling the first several inches of the soil is actually shredding the microorganisms that live there, especially the fungi and the fungal hyphae that have been created. These networks of strands just get ripped up and destroyed, and it takes fungi a long time to reproduce, so goodbye fungi. And then the use of fertilizers and herbicides and pesticides on top of that. These nutrients are in a soluble form, which is good, but the way they get them in that form is to combine them with an ion, and when you have a cation and an anion, you have a salt, and salt will absorb water and it will further destroy the soil food web. Development, as I mentioned, is converting a lot of good soil and wetlands and forests into impermeable surfaces, and then a spin-off negative effect of this is we are seeing increased erosion. So the water is pooling on impermeable surfaces, and it's wiping off any chemicals that have been stuck on that hard surface into storm sewers or into drainage ditches and fields, and sweeping away the topsoil, and then putting it into lakes and rivers and oceans, and adding all those chemicals that have been trapped on that hard surface, putting it right into a water body where it pollutes the aquatic environment, often causing too many nutrients in that environment, which causes algal blooms, decreased oxygen, and major fish kills and water quality problems. And then to exacerbate all of this, there's the issue of climate change, with unpredictable and more extreme weather events causing more erosion and inputting more chemicals and carbon dioxide and acid rain onto our lands and in our air and in our water, just further destroying that soil food web, that healthy life in the soil. So just to explore more the biological approach of restoring soils using the soil food web, or I shouldn't even say restoring, just growing plants using the Soil Food Web, or growing plants using chemical fertilizers. For the Soil Food Web, all the nutrients that a plant needs are in the soil. Mother Nature designed it this way. That's why the earth is happy and thrives without human interference, as long as we're growing what's meant to be grown in that soil. But they just need the Soil Food Web to be there to make those nutrients available. And then the Soil Food Web delivers the nutrients to exactly where they're needed, the plant roots. And because of this natural process of a living organism growing, living its life, excreting its wastes, it's a slow release, consistent, and long-term source of nutrients. And interestingly, the types of exudates that the plant puts out attracts the types of organisms that bring in the types of nutrients that that plant needs. So if the plant needs more bacteria in its early stages of growth, it will attract more bacteria. If it needs more fungi and those nutrients that come with that, it'll send out different exudates that appeal more to fungi. And then the bacteria produce glues and the fungi produce microfilaments that will create aggregates in the soil, which creates air passageways and allows for oxygen flow and better water retention. So this happens naturally, and it aerates the soil to greater depths over time. Chemicals don't do this. Usually only a few chemicals are available to plants when you buy a chemical fertilizer. And like I said, they're bound to ions, which are salts. Only 40% of sprayed chemical fertilizers are used by the plants. The rest ends up volatilized in the atmosphere or runs off polluting waterways. And chemicals are usually quick release, so they need multiple applications. As you can see, the take home here is positive environmental impact with the Soil Food Web, major problems with the chemical fertilizers. Another benefit is the Soil Food Web is actually low cost once it has been restored. It should take care of itself with a little bit of, a bit of maintenance and other regenerative practices. You can't continue to be hard on your soil. Chemical fertilizers can be pretty expensive because you've created a reliance on them. You need them year after year. Compost is the breaking down of organic material. There are different qualities of compost, and a high quality compost should be very diverse in the bacteria and the fungi and the soil food web that it contains. More diverse than anything you can buy. And the benefits of this diverse biology, the microbes outcompete bad guys. So if you have any root-feeding nematodes or other disease-causing organisms, throw in a bunch of good bacteria and tend to them. They will outcompete the bad guys and give your plant what it needs so that it can become more robust and resistant to future attacks from pests. The microbes also build structure and they cycle nutrients. Aerated thermal compost. That's one kind of compost. There's also non-aerated and vermicompost and many other kinds, but these are the three main kinds. We only recommend using aerated thermal compost and vermicompost. Vermicompost is the worm compost that is made from the castings of worms that have processed organic wastes. When I say aerated, I mean turned so that oxygen reaches all parts of the pile. And when I say thermal, I mean it reaches a certain temperature at the core, at the center, and it is turned so many times that all parts of the pile are eventually in the center at that high enough temperature. And that high temperature cooks the weed seeds and kills off the pathogens. And because we're adding oxygen through turning, we are creating an environment that helps the beneficial aerobic organisms thrive. So how do we make aerated thermal compost? It starts with diverse quality materials. So you want to develop a good compost recipe, and I have ranges listed here, but the general ballpark is you just need a little bit of high nitrogen material, a bit more for green materials, and over 50% of your compost pile should actually be woody materials. So high nitrogen materials are things like manure and legumes. Those high nitrogen materials feed bacteria, and the bacteria reproduce really quickly, and they're responsible for generating that heat that sterilizes the pile. So that's good, and it gives the whole decomposition process a good boost. But then once they exhaust the high nitrogen foods, they need something with more of a slow burn. So that's where the green materials come in. And now they can just happily munch away at the leaves, the freshly cut greens, yard trimmings, and maybe vegetable scraps that you've included in that compost pile. And finally, we're hoping to generate a lot of fungal growth in our compost. That's a little bit trickier to do. It takes longer. So we need a lot of wood. That can be wood chips, cardboard, brown leaves. Those are all great sources of woody material, like egg cartons. A good mix of all of these ingredients will create a diverse food, and then diverse organisms that eat that food. But again, we want at least 50% woody material for that really slow burn, so that the fungi have the time to grow, because it takes them a lot longer than bacteria to grow, and we want a compost that has a lot of fungi in it. And I'll get more into that later. And then you need to monitor your compost pile. So you're looking at the temperature. As I mentioned, you need the inside of the compost pile to get nice and hot, above 55 degrees Celsius, to cook off the weed seeds. And you need to hold it at that temperature for 3 days. And then you need to turn it 3 times to make sure that all parts of the pile have been in the center, have had a chance to get sterilized. And you also need to monitor the moisture daily. And you're looking for above 50% moisture, because the bacteria and fungi and other soil microbes like an almost aqueous environment. They won't grow if it's too dry, and the pile could become anaerobic if it's too wet. You can measure that using your hand and doing the squeeze test. So taking a clump of compost and giving it a really hard squeeze, and if you get dribbles of water coming out, it's too wet. If you don't get any water coming out, it's too dry. You're just looking for 2 or 3 drips to pool up just on your hand here. And if it's not wet enough, take the hose and give it a nice misting shower. And it's best to do this when you're actually turning the compost pile. So as I said, turn is needed, but it needs to be turned at least 3 times to ensure all parts of the pile reach the center where the pile is the hottest. So creating this compost can be pretty labor intensive, and it takes a long time, and it is a bulky ingredient, but only 4 to 5 pounds of this high quality compost can create 100 gallons of compost tea that has even more biology in it. So making compost tea, and I'm going to use the term aerated compost tea, or ACT, because there are several different kinds of compost tea. People have been making this for a long time and experimenting in a lot of different ways, but we believe aerated compost tea is the best because it caters to the aerobic organisms. And as I mentioned before, anaerobic organisms are usually bad. That's pests and viruses, things like E. coli, Salmonella. They all like low oxygen environments. So as long as we're keeping a lot of oxygen in there, the organisms that like oxygen are going to thrive, and they're not going to leave enough food for the anaerobic organisms. Making aerated compost tea. It starts with good compost. So we get our high quality compost because that's the source of all of the organisms that are going to end up in this compost tea. Then we add water, and it should be dechlorinated water. So well water is excellent, but if you have to use chlorinated water, you can bubble it for a while to let it off gas the extra chlorine. And then we add foods. So when we're making an aerated compost tea, we're actually growing the microbes that were in that 5 to 6 pounds of compost per 100 gallons. We brew for 24 to 36 hours at a nice room temperature setting. If it's on the cooler side, they're not going to reproduce as fast. And if it's too hot, they might reproduce too fast and use up the oxygen too quickly, creating anaerobic conditions which could breed anaerobic bacteria, which are bad. And then we must use a microscope to confirm that nothing bad happened, nothing went wrong. If everything was done correctly, we used aerated compost and we aerated our compost tea, we should see only good biology, and we're also looking for diversity of biology and an abundance. So just to recap the differences between compost and compost tea, aerated thermal compost is a living, solid soil amendment made from a mix of high nitrogen to high carbon materials. It is turned to aerate. It is allowed to mature, reaching its peak diversity at around 6 months and lasting for around 2 years, depending on the conditions. It needs to be taken care of. It can be sifted and used for seed starting. It can be blended into the soil, or it can be spread over top of soil as a top dressing. Aerated compost tea is a living liquid soil amendment. It is made from water, compost, and microbial foods. It is bubbled to aerate. It is brewed for 24 to 36 hours and used within 24 hours. That's when it's at its best diversity and abundance of organisms based on the foods that you have added and the aeration that was given. You can store it in the fridge for a few days. That just slows everything down. But why get a worse product like 3 days later when you can time it so that you use it immediately and apply the best product? It can be sprayed onto a soil, onto leaves or foliage, or injected into the root zone. So that's good for bigger trees. Microscopic analysis is a big part of what we do to understand what's in our samples. We use the microscope to look at the starting soil of the land that we are looking to restore. We also look at the compost that we're making, and finally we examine the compost tea, even multiple times during the brew cycle, to make sure that we are reaching the peak diversity and abundance of soil food web that we're looking for. And of course, we're looking at the different microbes and counting them and categorizing them and creating sort of a report card. So we're looking at the number and diversity of bacteria, fungi, protists, nematodes, and then the different functional groups within the nematodes. So how many bacterial feeding, fungal feeding, predatory or root feeding nematodes do we see? We're making sure that there are no disease-causing organisms, and we're calculating the fungi to bacterial ratio. What is the fungi to bacterial ratio, or the F to B ratio? This is the amount in grams of fungi to bacteria in any sample of compost tea, or soil. If the F to B is below 1, that means there's more bacteria than fungi. If it's greater than 1, it means you have a fungal-dominated soil or sample. It is important to know the F to B ratio of your compost or your compost tea or your starting soil, because different plants need different F to B ratios to thrive. And plant succession is a great way to think about what fungi to bacteria ratio the plant needs. If you're looking at a bare soil, so maybe a soil after a forest fire or a new development, the plants that pop up first are the weeds. These plants have a quick life cycle, shallow roots, so they don't put a lot of investment into that. They put the investment into making seeds and spreading. And they prefer soil that is bacterial dominated. And bacteria grow kind of the same way. They just reproduce really quickly. So they're the first thing that takes over soil. So they go hand in hand. They evolve together. And then by year 2, you're getting some annuals, some perennials. Maybe you're even growing a vegetable garden. So the amount of fungi needs to increase slightly to support more water holding capacity for deeper roots and more structural component in the carbon materials in the plant stalks. but we're still looking at a soil that is bacterial dominated. Then when we get into the woodier plants like the shrubs and then moving on to the trees, we actually need more fungi in the soil than bacteria, because the fungi again are going to support those structural components of the plants. And then when we move all the way into the forest, we're looking at an F-to-B ratio of 100 to 1,000. We can't make a compost or compost tea with an F-to-B ratio this high because it takes a long time for fungi to reproduce to reach those levels. But when we make a compost tea or compost for trees specifically, we're aiming to get the highest fungal component that we can possibly get to feed these organisms. So once we've made our compost tea, we transport it and apply it to where it is needed. We move the tea into the holding tank on the back of our truck where it is continually aerated. And we move quickly because we don't want the hot summer sun to heat up the liquid so much that, again, you lose oxygen and it becomes anaerobic. So it's continually aerated. We get to the site and we inject or spray based on the needs of the plant. So we can actually take a deep root injector, as shown in this picture of my boss, downtown Toronto, injecting for tree health. So that's getting in deeper to reach the tree roots, just the first couple of feet. So then microbiology covers the soil and the plant surfaces and begins to work with the minerals that are there to convert them to a soluble form. All equipment is thoroughly cleaned after use. This is important because we don't want to risk contamination. If we're not monitoring the residues of organisms that have stuck to the inside of the surfaces of all of our equipment, which we aren't, it's something else that we don't know what it is, and it can become anaerobic, and it could contaminate future batches of tea. So we need to flush out all of our equipment with clean water, and we do that as soon as possible so it doesn't stick on. That includes the compost tea tank, unless we're brewing back to back and everything is staying aerobic. So from finished brew to application is less than 12 hours. If it's so great, why doesn't everybody use it? Actually, people have been experimenting with compost tea for a very long time. They just make it in a variety of different ways, and they have some really interesting and potentially beneficial products. But without a microscope, you don't know for sure. So we haven't really been studying compost tea in such an in-depth scientific way until Dr. Elaine Ingham and the Soil Foodweb came about in the 1990s, I believe. And now we are starting to build a database of what is a good compost tea and what tea suits what kind of plants and things like that. Before, everything was more anecdotal. So it's so great. Why doesn't everybody use it? It's made of living organisms, therefore it is always changing. They're evolving, they're eating their foods, their populations are changing. They're sensitive, some of them are dying. And you can't bottle a living creature without giving it oxygen and food, so it has actually no shelf life. And because it's a living organism and it's always changing, it's really hard to get a certification on this product because it's not standard. Like, every batch is different. We can tell you what's in it by looking at it with a microscope, but the organisms in it will change. Even if we measure every ingredient to the milligram, the biology will change based on the air temperature, the age of the compost pile, the time that it takes to deliver to the site, and then how it interacts with the native biology. So it's still a very anecdotal and very much of an art kind of a product, but we're making it as scientific as we can. It's a messy and manual process to make it home. So turning those compost piles, dealing with the manure, and then using all that water and cleaning all the equipment after. It's a very physical process, and you need some space if you're going to do it on a larger scale. And then finally, you need a microscope and knowledge in determining what you're seeing under the microscope to know if your soil or compost tea sample is what you need. So just to recap everything for our final slide, restoring soils with biology. Aerated compost tea, or ACT, is high quality compost that is aerated, thermal, and diverse, plus food, plus water, plus air. ACT is an all-natural plant supplement that works by introducing beneficial microorganisms to the soil, or plant leaves. These beneficial microbes can outcompete disease-causing organisms, greatly enhance nutrient cycling, and build soil structure. Depending on what soils are missing, a compost or compost tea can be designed to grow these microbes. Because compost tea is a liquid and requires only a few pounds of compost per 100 gallons of water, large areas of land can be treated. It can also be used on pots, individual plants, seeds, home gardens, trees, etc. There is great potential to drastically reduce the need for synthetic fertilizers and pesticides or herbicides in our soils, plants, bodies of water, and the human body with the use of ACT. Thank you for your attention. Have a great day.